Sometimes the worst decision in a scary story is the one that made perfect sense 5 minutes earlier. You open a door, give someone a code, hold your ground in an argument, answer one more call, and only afterward do you understand what that choice actually put in motion. That's where this batch lives. These stories are less about obvious danger and more about judgment. When to trust somebody, when to back off, when being polite stops being worth it, and when protecting yourself means doing something that feels rude, selfish, or even cowardly in the moment. There are a few decisions here that I think most people would second guess afterward, even if they made exactly the same choice. If you enjoy these grounded Reddit-style stories, you can help out by liking the video or subscribing. For now, we're starting with one locked apartment door and the stranger who needed somebody else's key. The next morning, I knew something had happened before I even opened my apartment door. Our building is small, and after you've lived there for a while, you get used to its normal noise. You know roughly when somebody is on the stairs or when people are standing around in the hall. That morning, there were too many voices outside my door. They were low, then quiet, then somebody else would start talking. It wasn't normal for that time of the morning, so I threw on a sweatshirt and went out. A few tenants were gathered near the second floor landing, and Mr. Carver's apartment door was open. He was an older guy who'd lived there longer than I had. Somebody told me he'd been taken to the hospital overnight. He'd been beaten, and his apartment had been robbed. Our landlord got there not long after. He was going around asking if anyone had seen somebody in the building the night before. Then he said the man who got into Mr. Carver's place had told him he needed to check a problem with the pipes. The landlord hadn't sent anybody over. I said, "Wait, I let somebody in." Everybody looked at me, which was as bad as it sounds. I told them I'd come back with my dog the night before, and there'd been a man waiting near the front door. He'd said there was a leak in the basement, and that he was trying to reach the landlord but couldn't get inside. I had my keys in my hand, so I opened the door for him. At that point, that was pretty much all I knew. I didn't know if he'd come there for Mr. Carver or if he decided what to do after he got inside. I still don't know. But once the landlord said nobody was supposed to be there, I started replaying the previous night. Things that had seemed completely ordinary a few hours earlier suddenly didn't sit the same way. I've lived in that building in Providence for years. It's an old 3-story rental, and little repairs are just part of living there. The front door opens into a small shared vestibule, and then a narrow hall. The stairs go up from there, and the basement access is toward the back. A lot of the old plumbing is down there, so having somebody come in to look at a leak or fix something wasn't unusual at all. Actually, we'd had more contractors around than normal in the weeks before this. There had been plumbing work and a few other small repairs. They weren't always the same people either. Sometimes I recognized whoever was there, sometimes I didn't, and before this happened, I never thought there was anything strange about that. The outside door normally stayed locked. Tenants had keys. If you didn't live there, somebody had to let you in. That's the whole system. Nothing fancy. The night before, I'd taken my dog out later than usual. It wasn't extremely late. It was just dark. I was tired, and I wanted to get back upstairs, wipe his paws, feed him, and be done for the night. When I came back, there was a man near the entrance. He looked like somebody who'd come to work on the building. Work pants, a jacket, a small tool bag. He wasn't lurking around or trying too hard to act friendly. He mostly looked irritated that he couldn't get inside. Again, with the amount of repair work we'd had going on, that didn't strike me as weird. He asked if I lived there. I said yes. Then he told me he was there for a leak in the basement and had been trying to get hold of the landlord, but he couldn't get into the building. I looked at his bag, then at the door. That was honestly about the whole thought process. I know that probably sounds careless now. Maybe it was. But at the time, we'd had plumbing problems, and we'd had contractors in the building recently. My dog was pulling on the leash a little, my keys were already in my hand, and I didn't think I was making some serious decision. I thought I was letting in a guy who was there to work, so I unlocked the door. I held it while he came in behind me. Once we were inside, he asked where the basement stairs were. I pointed down the hall and told him they were in the back. He thanked me and I went upstairs with my dog. That was the last time I saw him. I fed the dog, changed clothes, and did the usual stuff before bed. For a while, I heard movement somewhere below me, but that's normal in that building. Sound carries badly. A pipe knocks, or a door closes hard, and half the time you can't tell which floor it came from. Later, there was one heavy thud from below, then a little more noise. I noticed it, but I didn't sit there wondering about it. As far as I knew, there was a maintenance guy downstairs, working on something. The sound already had an explanation in my head. I didn't get up or go look. After a while, it was quiet again, and I went to bed, still thinking the whole thing at the front door had been a 2-minute interaction with a contractor. I wasn't lying there worried about him. By then, I'd basically stopped thinking about him at all. The next morning, I learned that the man I'd let through the locked entrance had gone to Mr. Carver's apartment and used the same story. He said there was a leak, and he needed to check the pipes, and Mr. Carver opened his door. The landlord was the one who told us that, based on what Mr. Carver had been able to explain before he was taken to the hospital. Once I heard that, I thought about the thud again. Not because I'd known what it was when I heard it. I hadn't. That's the part I keep trying to be fair about with myself. At the time, I thought somebody was working downstairs. By morning, I knew there hadn't been anybody working downstairs at all. I don't know what the man knew before he came there. Maybe he'd been watching the building. Maybe he hadn't. I don't know whether he knew anything about Mr. Carver or whether he just got inside and picked a door. I don't know how long he'd been outside before I came back with the dog. Anything beyond what I actually saw or what the landlord told us would just be me filling in blanks. The part I don't have to guess about is the front door. When I first saw him, he was outside it and couldn't get in by himself. I used my key and let him through. And that's the piece I have trouble getting away from. When he went to Mr. Carver's apartment later, he wasn't standing out on the sidewalk trying to get somebody to open the main entrance. He was already inside the shared hall. I can't say what Mr. Carver thought when he opened his apartment door, but I can understand why a man already standing inside the building might seem like he belonged there more than a stranger outside would. There wasn't some big explanation later. Mr. Carver was in the hospital. Things were missing from his apartment, and the man I let in had nothing to do with our landlord or any of the actual repair work. That's really all I know for certain about what happened after I went upstairs. I don't tell myself that if I'd refused to open the door, then none of it could have happened. I can't know that. Maybe he would have waited for another tenant. Maybe he would have left and tried again later. I genuinely don't know, and I don't think pretending I know makes any of this more honest. But I was the one who opened it for him that night. Since then, I don't let people into the building just because they say they're there to work on something. If I don't recognize them, I make them contact the landlord or I call him and wait until I know they're actually supposed to be there. Sometimes it's awkward. Somebody is standing there with tools, clearly annoyed, and I'm making them wait outside. I'm okay with that now. I still use the same key every day. It's just the key to the front door of an old apartment building, and before that night, I'd used it hundreds of times without giving it any thought. Now, when I put it in that lock, I remember that I was the one who used it to let him inside. I would have a hard time blaming the narrator for this. One, because the entire setup was built to feel normal. There had been contractors around. The guy had tools. He had a believable complaint about getting inside. Even the noises later already had an explanation attached to them in the narrator's head. That's how ordinary the whole thing felt until morning. The awful part is knowing that opening the main door may also have made him look more legitimate when he reached Mr. Carver's apartment. He was no longer a stranger standing outside. He was a man already inside the building. I completely understand why the narrator changed the way they handled that door afterward. A few awkward minutes making somebody wait is a very small price compared with carrying that memory again. I keep going back and forth on whether I should even post this because, on paper, it sounds like such a dumb chain of decisions. Nothing about the guy seemed obviously wrong at first. One of my roommates sold a mini fridge on Facebook Marketplace. The buyer came to get it, and that should have been the whole story. I rent a room in a house with a few other people around my age. We all work different schedules and mostly do our own thing. We share the kitchen and common areas, but our bedrooms are our own spaces, and most of us keep them locked. The house has a side entrance with a keypad. Same code for everybody. The roommate selling the fridge was at work when the buyer wanted to come by, so he told the guy he could let himself in and grab it. He sent him the code, explained where the fridge was, and somewhere in that conversation also made it clear that people were normally gone during the day. Yes, I know. That part sounds bad now. At the time, it mostly just sounded lazy. I was supposed to be at work too. I woke up with a migraine bad enough that my phone screen hurt to look at, called out, closed my blinds, and stayed in bed. My bedroom door was locked, but I almost always locked it anyway. Later that morning, I heard the keypad beep. I already knew somebody was coming for the fridge, so I barely reacted. I heard the side door open, a man walk into the common area, and then all the scraping and bumping you'd expect from somebody trying to move a mini fridge alone. Honestly, my first reaction was irritation, because every scrape felt 10 times louder with my head pounding. For a couple of minutes, everything sounded normal. He got the fridge toward the side door, and eventually I heard him take it outside. The door shut, quiet, again. I stayed in bed. There was no reason to go introduce myself to some marketplace guy who wasn't even there to meet me. Then, maybe a minute later, I heard the keypad beep a second time. I figured he'd forgotten something. A cord maybe. One of the shelves. Whatever. Except, he didn't walk back to the spot where the fridge had been. His footsteps went farther into the house. Then I heard a cabinet open. A drawer opened and shut. And after that, I heard him move farther from the kitchen. There was another door. At first, I was still trying to make the harmless explanation fit. Maybe my roommate had told him something I didn't know about, but there was no reason for him to be opening random cabinets or heading toward the bedrooms. That was when I realized he was going through the house. I couldn't see him, so I don't know exactly what he touched or what he took at that point. I could only hear him moving around and opening things. He wasn't wandering like somebody who was lost. He'd check something, move on, check something else. I remember thinking I should go out and tell him to leave, and then immediately thinking that was an awful idea. I'd have to open my bedroom door and step into the same hallway as a stranger who was already inside our house, stealing from us. I was the only person home, as far as I knew. And he didn't know that, so I stayed quiet. That was basically the only advantage I had. He thought the house was empty. I didn't want to give up my exact location while there was still a locked door between us. I started tracking him by sound. He moved out of the common area and farther down the hall. I heard one of the other bedroom doors open, then some movement inside that room. Not long after that, he was back in the hallway. By then, I wasn't wondering if I was overreacting anymore. I wasn't even really thinking about what he might be taking. I was thinking about how close he was getting to my door. The footsteps came farther down the hall. Then they stopped right outside my room. My door handle moved. It went down once and hit the lock. I just sat there staring at it. I know that sounds passive, but I genuinely didn't know what else to do that wouldn't put me in a worse position. A few seconds earlier, staying silent meant he didn't know I existed. Now he was actually trying my door. The handle moved again. I didn't open it or walk up to it. I just said loudly enough for him to hear me. "There are people home. You need to leave." He stopped. No response, no excuse. I heard him step away and move quickly back down the hall. His footsteps crossed the common area, the side door opened, and then it shut. I still didn't come out immediately. Maybe people will say that was excessive, but I had no way of knowing whether he'd actually left or was just standing somewhere quiet. I waited until I hadn't heard anything for a while before I unlocked my bedroom door. A couple of doors were open that hadn't been before, and some drawers had been left out. I couldn't tell what was missing, because most of the stuff wasn't mine. When my roommates got home, we checked. A few things really were gone, mostly small electronics. One roommate was missing a pair of headphones. Nothing huge, just things somebody could grab fast and carry out. So that answered one question. He hadn't just been snooping around or looking for some missing fridge part. He was stealing from us. What we never figured out was whether he came there planning to do that, or whether he picked up the fridge, realized he had the code to a house that was supposedly empty, and decided to take advantage of it. I honestly don't know. I'm not going to pretend I know what his plan was. We changed the keypad code that day. There was also a pretty ugly argument about giving out a shared door code and telling a stranger nobody was usually home. My roommate knew he'd screwed up, so it wasn't exactly productive. I think that's why I'm still angry more than anything. Before this, the keypad was just a thing I punched numbers into when I came home. We changed the code, but I still use that same side door every day. And now, every time I hear those buttons beep from inside the house, I notice. The smartest decision in this story might be the one that feels the least traumatic: staying silent. Once the narrator realized that guy was searching the house, opening the bedroom door to confront him would have given away the only advantage they had. He thought nobody was home. The locked door was still between them. And even when he finally tried the handle, the narrator didn't step into the hallway. They just made it clear he had been discovered. That was enough. I think people sometimes imagine they'll immediately confront a stranger in their home, but this is a much more realistic reaction. You don't owe a burglar a fair warning or a face-to-face argument. Sometimes the best move is simply keeping one more locked door between you and them. I was about 15 when this happened. My parents had had the same allotment for a few years by then, so going there with my dad on a weekend was normal enough. I wasn't exactly volunteering for it at 15, but if he only had a bit to finish, he'd sometimes take me along so we could get it done quicker and get home. It wasn't a big site. The plots sat off narrow paths, with hedges along parts of them, and there was a communal shed used by the plot holders. The car park was back by the entrance rather than beside our plot, so you had a short walk through the site once you left the car. Dad wasn't in charge of the allotment. I should probably explain that because otherwise the key sounds more important than it was. There was a volunteer committee, and Dad helped out with a few practical jobs, so he carried one of the keys to the communal shed. Some shared equipment was kept in there, and a few of the plot holders stored their own tools there too. That was really the only reason the key mattered. If somebody needed the shed opened, Dad could open it for them, but he wasn't supposed to just hand the key over and then leave them alone with everybody else's stuff. We were only there for a quick job that day. I honestly couldn't tell you now exactly what we were doing, beyond tidying up a few things on our plot. It was something Dad could have done on his own, just slower. Not long after we got there, I noticed a man further down the site who I recognized. I didn't know him personally. He'd recently lost his plot after having a number of rows with other people there. I didn't know the full story then, and I don't now, so I don't want to pretend I understood whatever had happened between him and the committee. Mostly, I knew who he was because Dad had mentioned him, and because Dad went noticeably quieter whenever the man was around. He'd still talk to me and carry on with whatever he was doing, but he'd keep track of where the man was without making a big thing of it. The man came over and asked Dad if he had the key to the communal shed. Dad said he did. The man said some of his tools were still in there, and he wanted them. Dad told him that was fine, but he wasn't giving him the key. When we'd finished, he'd go over, open the shed, and wait while the man got his own things out. That annoyed him straight away. His argument was basically that they were his tools, so he shouldn't need someone supervising him while he collected them. Dad said there were other people's things in the shed as well, which was why he couldn't just hand the key over. They went over it a few times, but there wasn't much more to say. He wanted the key. Dad said, no. The man had a heavy garden spade with him. I'm mentioning that because once the conversation got unpleasant, it was hard not to notice. Not because he did anything with it. He'd already been carrying it around the allotment. He didn't raise it or point it at either of us. He was just standing there holding it while getting angrier with Dad, and that was uncomfortable enough. Dad didn't tell me everything was fine, but he didn't immediately pack up either. We only had a few minutes left. The path back towards the entrance was still clear, and the man wasn't in our way at that point. Dad told him again that he'd open the shed when we'd finished, and went back to the job. At first, I was more embarrassed than frightened. I was 15, and standing there while two grown men argued over a shed key was just awkward. To me, it looked like a stupid argument, with one of them being difficult, and my dad refusing to budge. There wasn't anything mysterious going on, and I wasn't thinking of it as some dangerous situation. The man wanted a key he wasn't supposed to have, and Dad wasn't giving it to him. What bothered me was that he didn't go back to whatever he'd been doing. He didn't leave either. For a while, he stayed nearer the plot he'd used before, close enough that we'd see him when we looked up. He wasn't calling things over at us or constantly restarting the argument. He just stayed around. At some point, I noticed he was nearer the main path. I couldn't say exactly when he'd moved, because I was helping Dad and wasn't watching him every second. Later, I looked again, and he was nearer the part we'd normally use to head back towards the entrance and the car park. I don't know if he was doing that on purpose. He knew the allotment, obviously, so he knew where the paths went, but that doesn't tell me why he chose to stand where he did. All I can really say is that I started paying more attention to where he was standing than to what he looked like or whether he seemed angry. I'd pick something up, help Dad with the last of the work, then glance over again. By then, the argument about the shed had more or less stopped. Nothing new was being said. He was still there though, and it was obvious the issue hadn't gone away. Dad had noticed it too. He stopped fussing over the last bits and started putting things away. Then he told me to get my stuff and stay with him instead of wandering ahead. I knew by then this wasn't just a normal row between adults, but I was still thinking mainly about the key. That was what they'd been arguing over from the start. Dad, on the other hand, kept looking towards the path back to the car park. When we came off our plot, Dad didn't turn towards the shed like he'd said he would earlier. He kept me with him and headed for the entrance. The man asked again if he was going to give him the key. Dad said no, not like that, and kept walking. I stayed beside him. It wasn't far to the car park, but parts of the path narrowed between the hedges and the plots. By then, the man was close to the way we needed to go. He wasn't actually blocking us. I don't want to make it sound like he stood across the path, because he didn't. We could pass him, we just couldn't do it without getting fairly close. Dad carried on, and the man moved the same way. He asked for the key again. Dad repeated that he wasn't handing over a key to a shed with other people's belongings in it. There wasn't some new argument after that. The man was still angry, still carrying the spade, and still going in the same direction as us. There's one narrower bit of path I remember better than the rest. By the time we reached it, it was pretty simple. If we kept going, we'd have to pass close to him. He never raised the spade. He never said he was going to hit either of us. Nothing happened that gave us some definite answer about what he was prepared to do. Dad just stopped. He looked at the man, then at me. It was quick. He checked I was beside him, took the shed key out of his pocket and put it on the ground at the edge of the path. Then he told me to go to the car. I did, and Dad came with me straight away. He didn't hang back to argue or start giving the man conditions about what he could take. When I looked back, the man had stopped to pick up the key instead of following us. We got to the car park, got in, and left. Dad barely said anything about it on the way home. I don't remember him explaining why he'd done it, and I don't think I asked much. What bothered me at 15 was that he'd spent all that time saying he couldn't give this man the key. Then, when it came down to it, he'd done basically that. I was embarrassed. It felt like he backed down. That was more or less how I understood it then, which sounds very 15 now. Dad was right. The man wasn't entitled to the key, and Dad had just spent several minutes saying exactly that. So, in my head, the obvious thing was that you didn't give in. Later, Dad heard from other people at the allotment that the man had gone into the shed and taken the tools he'd said were his. He'd also taken some things that weren't. I never found out whether he'd planned that from the start or just took the opportunity once he had the key. I don't know what would have happened if Dad had kept refusing either. The man never directly threatened to hit us, and I don't want to turn him into something I can't prove he was. We never had another confrontation with him after that. For us, that was the end of it. It took me a long time to stop thinking of that afternoon as Dad giving in over a key. I think I held on to that version because it was the easiest one for me to understand at 15. What I remember now is much simpler. Once we actually had to get past the man together, Dad checked where I was, put the key down, and left with me. I was 15, and I understand now why that changed what mattered to him. This one changes completely depending on whether you hear it as a 15-year-old or as an adult. At 15, I can absolutely see why dropping the key looked like losing. Dad had been right the entire argument. The man was not supposed to have it, and giving it up meant he later stole things from the shed. But once they reached that narrow path, the argument was no longer really about property. Dad had his kid beside him, an angry man nearby with a heavy spade, and one simple way to make sure that man stopped following them: a shed key and somebody else's tools can be replaced. That was the calculation. He didn't win the argument, but he got his son back to the car without finding out how far the situation might go. That seems like the better victory. I don't really know what to call this, because we were never dating, and she wasn't some random person online either. I knew her through mutual friends. We'd see each other at birthdays or group dinners, message once in a while, that kind of thing. We weren't close. We knew the basic stuff about each other, including where we worked. Then she hit a really bad stretch, where a bunch of things went wrong at once. Work was a mess, her personal life was worse, and she stopped coming around much. One night, I checked in on her and we ended up talking on the phone for a couple of hours. A few years before this, I'd gone through my own period where nights were hard, and being alone with my thoughts wasn't great. I'm not saying our situations were the same. I just remembered how much it mattered when somebody stayed on the phone with me, so I took her seriously. At first, it was fine. The calls weren't all about her. She'd ask about my day too, and sometimes she was the one who ended the call. Over the next few weeks, it just became normal for us to talk at night. She'd text, "You awake?" or call, and most of the time I answered, because I was home anyway. I also told her more than once that if she was having a really bad evening, she could call me. I want to be fair about that part. I didn't promise to be available all the time, but I did make myself very available. After a while, I was basically the person who always picked up. A few months later, my schedule changed at work. I started working later, and on the new shift, I couldn't keep my personal phone with me all the time. Even when I could check it, I couldn't disappear for a 2-hour call. I told her before the schedule changed. I wasn't trying to ghost her. I just said there would be nights when I wouldn't see a message until after work, maybe even the next morning. She said she understood. Then one morning, I checked my phone and had a whole string of messages from the night before. The first was normal. Then came a couple asking why I wasn't answering, and after that, they got more upset. The last one was something close to, "Soon you won't have to worry about me anyway." My first thought was that she knew exactly what kind of sentence would make me call. I feel shitty admitting that, because I still don't know if it was true. People who are genuinely in a bad place can say vague things too. I know that from experience. So I called her. She answered, and we talked for a long time again. She was upset, but afterward I still couldn't say the message was definitely just to get me on the phone. I also couldn't say it definitely wasn't. That was what kept getting me. I started pulling things back a little. If I had work in the morning, I'd tell her I could talk for 20 minutes, not until 2. If she called several times while I was busy, I might let it ring and text that I'd get back to her later. Sometimes she was completely normal about that. Other times she'd say I was getting distant or didn't want to hear from her anymore, then apologize later and say she knew I had my own life. Every so often, the wording would slide back into there being no point, or maybe I wouldn't have to deal with her much longer. Every time, I had basically the same argument with myself. Maybe she knew those words would make me call. Maybe she was actually doing that badly. I never got confident enough in the first explanation to risk being wrong about the second. So I kept answering. I tried making smaller rules instead. No really late calls before a shift. If I'd already said I was busy, I wasn't answering over and over. If I said I'd talk tomorrow, I wanted tomorrow to mean tomorrow. She started taking those limits, like I was pulling away from her. She'd ask what she'd done wrong. Sometimes she got angry and apologized later. A few times she told me she barely had anyone she could call and that I was the only person who actually answered. I hated hearing that. Not because I didn't care about her. That was the problem. It sounded like trust, so I felt like an asshole for resenting it. At the same time, it felt like I had somehow ended up with a job I didn't remember agreeing to. One evening, I was at work and didn't have my phone on me for a while. When I finally checked it, I had a message from one of our mutual friends. He said she was doing really badly and had asked him to get a message to me. She didn't want to talk to him. She wanted me, because apparently I was the person who could calm her down. He was just passing it along, and I don't blame him for that. I called her after my shift. That was when the whole thing started feeling different. Before, if I didn't answer, at least it was between me and her. Now, I knew somebody else might get pulled in, just to get back to me. I started checking my phone before bed, even when I was exhausted, and looking at it whenever I got a chance at work. I'd think about it before I even got home. If I don't answer tonight, what happens? Not long after that, I was in the middle of a shift when a coworker came to find me. He said there was a personal call on the main line for me, and whoever it was had said it was urgent. I picked up, and it was her. She was upset and said she'd been trying my phone and didn't know another way to reach me. I asked how she got the number, then felt stupid because it wasn't secret. She knew where I worked. I'd talked about my job plenty of times before any of this, and the main number was public. Personal calls sometimes got passed to employees if somebody said it was important. She told me she was having a terrible night and felt like I'd abandoned her. She kept asking what she was supposed to do if I wouldn't answer. I still can't tell whether calling my job was a deliberate way around the limits I'd set or whether she panicked and used the first other way she knew to reach me. What I did know was that I was standing at work, on a work phone, having the exact kind of conversation I had already said I couldn't keep having during my shift. Afterward, my coworker asked if everything was okay. I said it was a friend going through some personal stuff. He didn't push it. Before that, even when I checked my phone at work, I was still the one choosing to do it. This time somebody had called the workplace and another employee had to come find me. I finished the shift pissed off, then felt guilty for being pissed off. That had become pretty normal by then. When I got home, I wrote her one message. I rewrote parts of it a few times because I didn't want it to sound like I was punishing her. I said I couldn't be the person who had to be available every night or personally respond every time a message sounded like a crisis. If she was in immediate danger, she needed somebody physically near her, or actual crisis or emergency help. Me answering my phone could not keep being the solution. She replied almost right away. First, she was angry. Then, she said I was abandoning her after I had told her she could come to me. Then there was another vague message, the same kind that had gotten me to call before. I stared at it for a long time. And I didn't call. Maybe I should have done that months earlier. But I finally accepted there was no way for me to guarantee nothing bad would ever happen to her. I could answer every night and still not have that kind of control. I blocked her number and the account we used most. One of the apps still put blocked messages into a separate folder. For a while, I checked that folder way more than I should have. I'd read what was there and then hate myself for reading it, but I didn't answer. She didn't start using new numbers or accounts, and she didn't try to reach me through our friends again. The messages in that folder got less frequent and eventually stopped. That's basically the update, if you can call it one. Nobody we both knew ever told me something terrible had happened to her, but nobody gave me some neat answer proving those earlier messages were fake either. I still don't know how much of it was a real crisis. How much was her getting dependent on knowing I'd answer, or whether some of it was pressure she knew she was putting on me. I can leave my phone in another room now without feeling like I'm making a decision about whether somebody else lives or dies. I'm relieved about that, and I still feel guilty for being relieved. There's a really uncomfortable kind of guilt in this one, because the narrator's relief and compassion are fighting each other the entire time. He cared about her. He had offered support. So every time she used language that sounded dangerous, ignoring it felt impossible. But eventually the support had expanded from late night calls to mutual friends, and then all the way into his workplace. At some point, caring about somebody cannot mean giving them unlimited access to you. And I think the hardest realization is the one he finally reaches. Answering every call could never guarantee her safety anyway. He was carrying responsibility that no friend could actually control. Blocking her felt cruel because he still cared. The fact that he can finally leave his phone in another room without panicking says a lot about how much that situation had taken over his life. A lot of these stories come down to the same uncomfortable lesson. Making the safest choice does not always feel good while you're making it. Sometimes it feels rude. Sometimes it feels like backing down. Sometimes it feels selfish. And sometimes the bad outcome happened before you even realized you were being asked to make a serious decision. That's why hindsight can be so brutal. From the outside, the answer always looks cleaner than it did in the moment. I want to know what you would have done in the allotment story. Would you have kept the key or dropped it and left exactly like the dad did? Thanks for spending some time here with these stories. If you want to support the channel, comments, likes, and subscriptions all help. That's all I've got for this batch. Thanks for being here, and good night.